The morning Maeve Whitlock spent her last $18 on baby chickens, three of her neighbors said she'd lost her mind. One of them said it to her face. She didn't argue. She just loaded the crates onto the wagon and drove home through the April heat while Grant sat beside her in silence so thick she could feel it pressing on her ribs. $18. Every cent they had left in this world. No seed, no tools, no plan if she was wrong. Just 342 chicks, a memory of something terrible from her childhood, and the quiet, terrifying certainty that she had maybe 4 weeks to save everything, or lose it all forever. If you've ever made a decision that felt completely insane but you couldn't explain why it felt right, stay with me. Like this video, drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story has traveled, and let's find out together whether Maeve Whitlock was a genius or a fool. The spring of 1887 came in hot and mean, the kind of heat that felt personal, like the Dakota Territory was trying to settle some old score with the people stubborn enough to stay. Maeve Whitlock was 24 years old that April, though she didn't feel it. She felt older in the way that anyone feels older when they've spent a winter counting what they have left and watching the number get smaller every week. She was lean from rationing, sunburned at the collar and wrists from working outside in February cold, because the work didn't stop for weather. And she had a habit, that Grant had noticed and never mentioned, of doing math in her head at odd moments. During dinner, during prayers. In the middle of a sentence sometimes, her eyes going distant while she calculated something he couldn't see. Grant Whitlock was 27 and built for hard country, wide through the shoulders, slow to speak, the kind of man who showed affection by fixing things before you asked him to. He'd come to the Dakota Territory 4 years ago because land was land, and a man who worked it owned something real, something permanent. That idea had sustained him through 2 bad harvests and 1 winter so brutal that the memory of it still lived in his knuckles, which ached every morning now, regardless of temperature. They had 320 acres on the edge of the Whitmore settlement, which was less a town than a loose agreement between 14 families to exist in proximity and pretend that proximity was community. There was a trading post, a mill that worked 3 days out of 7, and the kind of social life that consisted mostly of people watching each other for signs of weakness. That morning, the morning everything changed, they were at the Calhoun trading post when the math finally stopped adding up. Maeve stood at the counter with Grant beside her, and she'd been doing the numbers for 3 days by then, so she already knew what the ledger said before Rutherford Calhoun laid it open on the counter. She knew it. She just needed to see it written down to confirm that the number in her head was real, and not something she'd manufactured out of exhaustion. $18.40. That was what they had. After the last of the winter supplies had been bought on credit, after the medicine for the horse that died anyway in February, after the cost of seed they hadn't planted yet because the ground was still frozen when they'd purchased it, and now something was wrong with it, something Maeve couldn't name but felt in her hands when she turned it over, a deadness, a wrongness. They had $18. Seed corn's gone up, Calhoun said. He was a large man with a careful voice, and he'd been watching Maeve's face while he said it, which meant he already knew what $18 didn't cover. Supply wagons have been short. Everyone's buying early this year. How much short? Grant asked. Calhoun told him. Grant went quiet in the particular way he did when a number hit him wrong. Not explosive, just a stillness, like an engine cutting out. He looked at the counter. He looked at his hands. He didn't look at Maeve, which was how she knew he was embarrassed. And she felt a swift, familiar ache at that because Grant Whitlock had never in his life deserved to be embarrassed. We'll manage, she said, to Calhoun and to Grant both. Outside, the settlement was already awake and moving. It was barely 7 in the morning, but the spring planting season wasn't a thing you approached casually out here. It was a siege, a campaign, a race against a calendar that had no patience for sleeping late or feeling sorry for yourself. Wagons moved along the main track. The Haverford boys were already heading out toward their eastern fields with seed and a new plow their father had bought in February. Dora Selwick was hanging something on a line in front of her house and watching Maeve from across the distance with the particular careful expression that neighbors wore when they suspected trouble. Maeve walked around the side of the trading post, out of view, and stood there for a moment with her hand flat against the rough wood siding. She was not a woman who cried easily. She hadn't cried in front of Grant once in 4 years of marriage, which wasn't because she didn't feel things, but because she'd decided very early that the kind of crying that came from fear or frustration was something she needed to handle on her own time. So she stood there for exactly as long as it took to get her breathing even, which was about 30 seconds. And then she turned around and went back to find her husband. He was standing by the wagon, and he looked up when she came around the corner, and the expression on his face was the one she recognized as him trying to think of something to say. She spoke first. "I want to tell you something," she said, "and I need you to hear all of it before you say anything." Grant leaned against the wagon side. "All right. When I was 11, Maeve said, in Ohio, before we came west." She paused, organizing the memory the way you organize a thing that's been sitting in the wrong order for years. "There was a summer when the grasshoppers came. Not just some grasshoppers. A plague. Like what the old-timers talk about. But I saw it myself. The sky went dark in the middle of the afternoon. And everything, corn, beans, garden plants, fence posts, the leather harnesses, they ate through everything inside of 6 hours." She looked at Grant steadily. "They stripped my father's fields down to mud. We survived that winter on credit and charity, and my father was never quite the same after it. Something broke in him." Grant was listening. He always listened carefully when Maeve talked about her father, because she didn't do it often. "I woke up this morning," she said, "and I walked out to check the fields before you were up." She stopped. "Grant, there are grasshopper nymphs hatching out there, in the south field along the creek side in the grass between the rows." She watched his face. "Thousands of them. Maybe tens of thousands." He was quiet for a moment. "Nymphs can't fly yet, I know, but in 4 weeks they can, and I've seen what they turn into." She held his eyes. "I think what's coming is going to be bad. I think it's going to be worse than people expect, and I think when the swarm arrives, there isn't going to be a single crop in this settlement left standing." Grant turned this over. He was not a man who dismissed his wife's opinions, which was one of the qualities that had made her want to marry him. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I don't want to spend $18 on seed corn that might get eaten to the ground in June." She took a breath. "I want to spend it on chickens." The silence that followed was the kind that had weight to it. "Chickens," Grant said finally. "Baby chicks, as many as we can get. Calhoun's got a notice on his board from a man over in Millhaven selling off a flock. He's been dealing with coyotes, and he's done with it. The price is right." She kept her voice level, practical, like she was discussing weather patterns. "Chickens eat grasshoppers, Grant. We build pens. We move them across the fields every day. We let them work through the nymph population before the nymphs mature. If I'm right about the infestation, we might be the only farm in the settlement with a standing crop in July. And if you're wrong," Grant said, "we have no seed, no crop, and a lot of chickens we can't feed." "Yes." He looked at her for a long time. "You're not wrong often," he said. "No," she said. "But I could be." Another pause, and she watched something move across his face that she couldn't quite name. Not resignation, not agreement, something more complicated than either. Like a man stepping off a ledge into water he can't see the bottom of, making his peace with it on the way down. "How many chicks?" he asked. "Molt." They came back from Millhaven 2 days later with 342 baby chicks in 6 wooden crates stacked on the wagon bed, and they came back with $4.20 left to their name, which was supposed to cover wire, timber, and canvas for the pens. It didn't cover all of it. Maeve stood in the barn the first night and looked at the crates and did the math one more time and came up $6 short of what she'd estimated. She sat down on a hay bale in the lamplight with the chicks peeping steadily around her, that thin, urgent sound that newly hatched birds make, like a question repeated at low volume without expectation of an answer, and she made a list of what she could build with what she had. The pens needed to move. That was the central requirement, the thing the whole plan depended on. Stationary chicken coops kept birds in one place, and grasshoppers moved, so the birds had to move with the infestation, following it across the fields the way a brush fire crew follows the edge of a burn. She needed pens light enough to drag, sturdy enough to hold, and low enough to the ground that the birds could actually reach the soil through the wire bottom. What she built, in the end, looked nothing like what she'd designed on paper. Grant found lumber in the old collapsed section of the back shed, boards that had been sitting under weather for 2 years and were soft at the edges but still structurally sound if you were careful about which ones you used where. He pulled nails from places that didn't need them anymore. Maeve traded 2 of the older laying hens she'd planned to keep as permanent stock for 40 yards of salvaged wire from Tom Alderton, who ran the mill and had acquired it from somewhere he declined to explain. The canvas came from a wagon cover that had torn the previous autumn and which she'd been meaning to patch and kept not getting around to. She cut it into sections. She used it for roofing on the pens, held up by bent wire ribs, light enough to fold back when the sun got severe. They built the first pen in 3 days. It was ugly. The joints didn't meet cleanly, and one of the side panels sat at a slight angle that Grant kept trying to correct and eventually gave up on. The sliding door stuck. The wire on the bottom was uneven in places, which meant some sections sat against the ground and some sections had gaps. And they spent an entire morning pressing dirt up against the gaps with their hands because they couldn't afford to lose chicks to snakes through a gap in the wire. But it moved. When Grant hooked the rope to the front frame and dragged it 10 yards across the yard, it held together and moved, and the chicks inside stumbled and regrouped and kept eating. That moment, Grant standing with the rope over his shoulder, looking back at the pen that was ugly and imperfect and held together with salvaged nails and borrowed wire, and the 342 chicks that represented the entirety of their future security moving inside it, that moment was the one Maeve came back to later, when things got worse. She came back to it because of how Grant looked. Not triumphant, not confident, just determined, in the quiet, particular way of a man who has made a decision and closed the door behind him and isn't going to spend any more time wondering what's on the other side. They needed more pens. But word got around fast in the Whitmore settlement, because word always got around fast in small communities where entertainment was limited, and other people's mistakes were one of the primary available forms of it. Maeve heard the first version from Dora Selwick on the 3rd day, when she came to the trading post for wire staples, and Dora happened to be there with her daughter. And Dora said, with the specific careful concern that is never quite concern, "I heard you bought yourself some chicks instead of seed corn." "We did," Maeve said. "That's—" Dora paused, performing the search for the right word. "Brave." "It's practical," Maeve said. "Amos thinks you should have bought seed," Dora said. "He said it this morning at breakfast. He said Grant Whitlock's wife has talked him into something foolish." Maeve counted out her wire staples. "Amos is welcome to his opinion." The word foolish followed her home, and she let it sit in the back of her mind like a stone in a boot, just uncomfortable enough to stay conscious of. It got worse over the following week. The Haverford father, a large, confident man named Elias Haverford, who had been farming Dakota land for 9 years and had strong opinions about everything, stopped Grant on the road one afternoon and offered his assessment without being asked. "You want to lose those birds to the foxes and the summer heat," he told Grant. "That's your business. But when the corn comes up short in July, you come to me and I'll sell you some off my surplus, at fair price." He paused. "I'm saying that as a neighbor." Grant came home that evening and told Maeve, and his voice was even and he didn't show anything on his face, but she could feel the weight of it on him the way you can feel a hand pressing on a bruise through cloth. "He's not wrong that we might lose birds," Maeve said. "I know. Some are going to die. I tried to account for it." "I know, Maeve." She looked at him across the supper table. "You believe in this?" He was quiet for a moment, and it was the honest kind of quiet, not the reassuring kind. "I believe in you," he said finally, which isn't exactly the same thing. She appreciated the distinction. She appreciated that he didn't pretend. They lost 11 chicks in the first week. Heat, mostly. The pens trapped warmth even with the canvas folded back. And on the days when the temperature climbed past 90, they had to set up shade structures over the pens and drag water out from the well twice daily. In buckets that Grant carried 2 at a time with his shoulders aching and his jaw set, and his expression the particular blank of a man refusing to show how tired he is. They lost 3 more to a weasel that found a gap in the south pen's wire at night. Maeve woke up at 2 in the morning to a sound that she knew before she was fully conscious, that particular shriek that meant a predator in the birds. And she ran from the house in her nightclothes with a lantern and a stick and found the weasel gone and 3 chicks dead and Grant coming up behind her pulling on his shirt and not saying anything because there was nothing to say. She repaired the gap in the dark with her hands shaking slightly. Not from cold, the night was warm, and went back to bed and lay there until morning doing the math. 328. Still 328 if the remaining losses held, still enough. The grasshopper nymphs, meanwhile, were spreading. This was the part that was both proof that she'd been right and deeply unsettling to watch. She walked the fields every morning, their fields, and, when she could do it without being obvious about it, the edges of neighboring fields. And she watched the hatching spread from the creek margins outward, moving through the grass between the crop rows, countless small brown bodies that would be harmless for another few weeks and catastrophic after that. She tried to describe it to Grant in the evenings, but the scale of it was difficult to convey without sounding like someone trying to justify a decision already made.
"How bad?" he asked one evening. "Bad," she said. "Worse than I thought when we started. Maybe much worse." He nodded slowly. "Then we need more pens. We don't have—" "I know." He leaned back in his chair. "I'm going to talk to Tom Alderton about that pile of lumber behind the mill. He's been meaning to clear it for 2 seasons. Maybe he'll take labor and trade."
He did. Tom Alderton accepted 3 days of work clearing and stacking the mill yard in exchange for enough lumber to build 2 more pens, and Grant did the 3 days and came home exhausted each evening and then spent the after-dinner hours building, by lamplight, until Maeve made him stop at 10 because she needed him functional for morning work. By the end of the 3rd week of May, they had 4 pens working the fields, 311 birds after all the losses, moving every day, sometimes twice a day, following the hatch. Maeve stood at the edge of the south field one evening in the last light and watched the birds working through the grass and felt something that wasn't quite confidence. Confidence was too smooth a word for what this was, but something adjacent to it, something harder, like the feeling of a rope in your hands when you know how much weight it's rated for. She was crouched down looking at the soil, at the places where the birds had worked 2 days before, when she heard boots on the dry ground behind her. She turned. It was young James Haverford, Elias's second son, 16, with his father's build and, she'd always suspected, considerably more of his mother's intelligence. "Mrs. Whitlock," he said, stopping a few yards back. He was watching the pens like he didn't want to be caught watching them. "What are they doing exactly?" "Eating," Maeve said. "The grasshoppers. The nymphs. The young ones. Before they can fly." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the pens. "Pa says it won't work." "I know what your pa says." Another pause. "Do you think it's going to work?" Maeve stood up. She looked at the boy and she thought about all the reassuring things she could say, the comfortable, certain things that a person in her position was supposed to say to demonstrate confidence and calm people down. Then she thought about what it would cost her if she turned out to be wrong. "I think I'm right about what's coming," she said. "I think this summer is going to be a bad one, and I think these birds are our best chance at getting through it." She paused. "I'm not certain. I'm working with what I know and what I remember and what I can see with my own eyes out here every morning. That's all." James Haverford looked at her for a moment in the fading light. Then he nodded once, slowly, like he was agreeing with something more than what she'd said. He walked back towards his family's land, and Maeve watched him go and turned back to the birds. 311. Still enough, if the losses held. Still enough. She stayed there until the light was gone, watching them work. The first week of June brought a heat that was different from what had come before. Heavier, drier, the kind that sat on the land like a weight pressing down. The creek dropped 2 inches in 4 days. The grass went from green-brown to flat brown, and the soil cracked along the edges where it had been damp from spring runoff. And the nymphs, Maeve's nymphs, the ones she'd been watching and tracking and moving her birds toward with methodical patience for 6 weeks, began to change. She noticed it on a Tuesday, early morning, before the heat had fully descended. She was walking the east field checking the overnight state of the pens when she saw that the young grasshoppers she'd been tracking were larger. Not by a little, by enough to be obvious. Their back legs were thickening, their coloration deepening from pale brown to something closer to olive gray. And there were more of them. Or rather, the same number of them were more visible now, more active, moving with a purpose they hadn't shown before. She stood in the east field with the morning light hitting the rows of corn at a low angle, and she felt it, the shift. The thing she'd been waiting for and dreading in equal measure. The nymphs weren't weeks away from maturity anymore. They were days. She walked fast back to the house, still doing math, and found Grant in the barn. "We have to move the pens every day now," she said. "Every day? Twice a day, if we can manage it. And I need you to build another one." Grant looked up from what he was doing. "Another? I know. I know we can't afford it. Can you do it anyway?" He looked at her for a long moment. "How long do we have?" "Maybe a week before they're mature, maybe less." He put down what he was holding. "Then I better start tonight." They were both exhausted by the end of that week in a way that went past tired into something else. Something that lived in the body as a low, persistent hum, a background noise of depletion that made simple tasks feel slow and complicated, ones feel nearly impossible. Grant had built the 5th pen in 4 nights working by lamplight, and it was the ugliest one yet, barely square. The roof panel held on with a combination of wire and rope and what appeared to be a belt buckle he'd found in the barn. But it moved, and it held birds, and that was what it needed to do. 304 birds now. 7 more lost in the past 2 weeks. 2 to a fox, 1 to heat prostration, 4 to some illness. Maeve couldn't identify that had moved through the north pen for 2 days and then stopped as suddenly as it had started. She'd lost sleep over those 4. She'd sat with the sick birds in the pen at night checking on them because she couldn't do anything useful, but she also couldn't not be there. And Grant had come out at midnight on the second night and sat beside her in the dark without saying anything, which was the right thing to do. 304 birds. Still enough. She told herself that every morning. 304. Still enough. The grasshopper nymphs were nearly mature. And somewhere to the southwest, in the direction of the flat horizon that the settlers had learned to watch the way sailors watched the sea, the sky on clear evenings had started to have a quality Maeve didn't like. A brownish tinge at the edge late in the afternoon. A visual density that wasn't clouds and wasn't smoke. Something else. She watched it from the porch on the evening of June 12th. The light going orange and then red and then the strange flat grayish color that preceded full dark. And the horizon to the southwest carrying that faint brown quality. Like dust, but different from dust. And she felt the hairs on her arms rise under her sleeves. She knew what that was. She'd seen it once before, when she was 11 years old, the afternoon before her father's fields were eaten to the ground. "Grant," she said. He came to stand beside her. She pointed toward the southwest horizon. "Look at that." He looked. He was quiet for a moment. "What is that?" "That," Maeve said, and her voice came out very steady, which surprised her a little, "is them." She turned and went inside to check on the birds, moving faster than she'd moved in 2 weeks. They had 3 days, maybe less, and 304 birds standing between everything they owned and a sky full of hunger. She began making plans for a fight. She didn't sleep that night, not really. She lay down because Grant made her, told her flat out that she needed at least a few hours or she'd be useless by morning, and she didn't have the energy to argue with logic that was plainly correct. But sleep was a different thing from lying still in the dark. And what she did for the hours between midnight and 4 in the morning was closer to a kind of suspended wakefulness. Body horizontal, mind running, playing out sequences and contingencies like a general the night before a battle she wasn't sure she could win. 5 pens. 304 birds. 4 acres of corn, 2 acres of beans, the kitchen garden that had been the difference between eating and not eating for 2 winters running, against what was coming from the southwest. She got up at 4:15. Grant was already awake, sitting at the kitchen table in the dark with a cup of cold coffee he hadn't bothered to heat, which told her he hadn't slept either, but had been too stubborn to admit it. She sat down across from him, and they looked at each other in the early dark and didn't say anything for a moment because the situation had moved past the point where talking changed it. "I want to move all 5 pens into the corn rows," she said finally. "Today, before it gets hot." "That's going to take most of the morning." "I know. I want the birds in the crop, not around the edges of it. When the swarm comes, I want them as deep in the infestation as we can get them." Grant turned his cup in his hands. "The corn's going to take damage from the pens moving through." "I know." "Some stalks." "Grant!" She stopped him gently. If the swarm hits the way I think it's going to hit, damaged stalks from our pens are the least of what we're going to lose. I'd rather have standing corn with some broken stalks than bare ground. He was quiet, then nodded. All right, we start at first light. And I want to talk to Tom Alderton and James Haverford. He looked up. Elias won't like...
Not Elias. James. The boy's been watching us for 3 weeks. He's paying attention. And if the swarm is as wide as I think it is, we might need extra hands.
She said it plainly, practically, but she felt something underneath the practicality that she didn't put into words. A fear that was specifically about being alone in the middle of this, about 2 people not being enough. She and Grant had managed everything up to now on their own strength and stubbornness, and the particular pride of people who don't ask for help. But she'd done the math again in the dark at 2 a.m, and 2 people and 5 pens and 304 birds was a very thin margin against what she'd seen gathering on the horizon. I'll talk to Tom, Grant said. You talk to James. She found James Haverford at the mill at 7 a.m, before his father was likely to know where he was, and she told him straight what she'd seen on the horizon the night before, and what she thought it meant and what she was planning to do. She watched his face while she talked. He had a good face for listening, still, focused, the kind of attention that teenage boys rarely bothered to show because their pride usually got in the way. When she finished, he said, Pa thinks it's going to skip us. He thinks the main swarm's going to track north. Your pa could be right, Maeve said. I hope he is, but I watched my father lose everything to a swarm that the old-timers also thought was going to track somewhere else. And I'd rather spend 2 days preparing for something that doesn't come than spend 1 hour watching everything I own get eaten because I talked myself out of worrying. James chewed on his lip. He was looking at the ground between them. If I help you and the swarm doesn't come, Pa's going to say I wasted time when I should have been working our fields. Yes, she said, he will. And if it does come, and your birds work, then you'll have helped save something. He looked up at her. And our fields? She held his gaze. She didn't look away, and she didn't offer him a comfortable answer because she didn't have one. Your pa hasn't got any birds working his crop. If the swarm comes the way I think, and it's as heavy as what I saw in Ohio... She stopped, started again. I can't promise you anything about your pa's fields, James. I can only tell you that our birds are our best chance, and I could use a pair of extra hands, and I think you're smart enough to understand why I'm asking you instead of your father. A long pause. Wind moved across the mill yard, stirring dust. I'll come, James said. 2 hours, before pa's up and about. She didn't thank him effusively. She just nodded and said, 6 a.m, day after tomorrow, and walked back toward home. The day and a half that followed was the most sustained physical work Maeve had done in her life, and she had spent her entire life doing physical work. They moved all 5 pens into the crop rows, a process that required disassembling 2 of the pens partially because they were too wide to navigate the rows intact, which Grant had pointed out the night before, and which she'd known was probably true, but hadn't wanted to factor in because the math was already complicated enough. They reassembled them inside the corn, in the gaps between the rows, and the birds went strange from the disruption. More noise, more crowding at the pen walls, a general anxious energy that made the already tiring work feel like it was happening inside a gradually tightening space. Maeve moved through the day on the specific fuel of somebody who is committed to a plan and can't afford to second-guess it. She carried water. She checked wire joints. She replaced a cracked board on the 3rd pen that had been borderline for a week, and that she'd been meaning to swap out and hadn't gotten to. She crawled under the 2nd pen on her stomach in the heat of the afternoon because one of the wire panels had come partially loose from its frame and was creating a gap along the ground edge, and she worked in there with her tools while the birds moved around and over her, while dirt got into her hair and her collar, and the cut on her left palm that she'd gotten 2 days ago from a wire end and hadn't had time to properly clean. Grant worked without stopping beside her and sometimes ahead of her, and they spoke when they needed to and didn't when they didn't, which was the particular fluency of 2 people who have been through enough together that silence has stopped being uncomfortable and become instead just another form of communication. Tom Alderton came by late afternoon. He stood at the edge of the corn and looked at the pens arranged in the rows and said, in his careful, measured way, "That's something. Can you come the day after tomorrow?" Grant asked him. Maeve thinks the swarm. I know what Maeve thinks, Tom said. He'd heard. Everybody in the settlement had heard. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the pens, at the birds working steadily through the corn row floors. I'll come. I'll bring Ned. His boy, 14, big for his age. Don't know what we can do, but I'll come.
We'll figure out what to do when we see what arrives, Maeve said from under the second pen, her voice slightly muffled by the fact that she was lying on her stomach. Right now, I just need people who won't panic. Tom made a sound that might have been a laugh and walked back toward his mill.
The morning of June 14th arrived clear and brutally still. No wind.
That was the first thing Maeve noticed when she stepped off the porch at 4:30, still pulling on her second boot.
A complete absence of wind, the kind of stillness that the prairie didn't usually produce. It was a windy country, Dakota. The wind was so constant that you stopped noticing it the way you stopped noticing the sound of a clock, and its absence now felt loud. Wrong. The grass stood absolutely upright. The corn rows were motionless. Even the air against her skin felt different, a strange flatness, like everything had been pressed down under something heavy. She stood in the yard and looked southwest, and the horizon was gone. Not dark, it was pre-dawn and dark in every direction. But there was something in the southwest that was darker than dark, a density at the edge of the sky that had texture to it, that moved in ways that cloud didn't move. She stood there for approximately 10 seconds, and then she went back inside and woke Grant with her hand on his shoulder and said, "It's time." He was up and dressed in 3 minutes. She had already started. James Haverford arrived at 6 as promised, looking like he'd run part of the way, which he probably had. Tom Alderton and his boy Ned came 20 minutes later with a second coil of wire that Tom had apparently decided to bring on his own initiative, which Maeve noted and felt grateful for without saying so. She was already in the corn checking pen joints and bird counts, and she called instructions back over her shoulder while she worked. "Tom, I need you and Ned on the north side. Grant's going to take the east pins. James, you're with me on the south." She paused, pulling a wire pin tight. "When it hits, the first thing you're going to want to do is run. Don't. They're just insects. They can't hurt you in any serious way. Stay with your pens, keep the birds moving, and if a panel comes loose in the chaos, just hold it in place until someone can get to you." "What if there's too many?" Ned Alderton asked. He was 14 and trying to sound like the question was practical rather than frightened. "There will be too many," Maeve said. She looked at the boy directly. "There will be a lot more than any of us can handle with birds and hands. The question isn't whether the swarm overwhelms us. It will. The question is how much of it the birds can take down before it moves on. Every bird in these pens is working right now, eating nymphs, taking numbers out of the infestation." She straightened up. "Every grasshopper they eat now is one that doesn't eat our corn." The boy nodded, swallowing. It was 6:20. The sky to the southwest was no longer pretending to be something other than what it was. The sound arrived before the swarm did. That was the thing nobody told you about, the thing that Maeve had forgotten from childhood, or perhaps had been too young to fully register. The sound. It came on the still air like something vast and mechanical, a dry, clicking, rasping mass of noise that was quieter than you'd expect at first, and grew steadily, inexorably, until it was no longer background noise but the only noise, filling the air from ground to sky in every direction and pressing on the ears in a way that was close to physical. "What is that?" James said, very quietly. "That's them flying," Maeve said. She looked at Grant across 2 rows of corn. He was standing by the east pens with his jaw set and his hands steady, and he met her eyes, and she held his gaze for a moment, and then they both turned and looked southwest, and the swarm arrived. It came as a wall. That was the only word for it. A wall. A moving vertical mass that reduced the morning light to something amber and strange as it passed between the fields and the sun. Maeve had braced herself for it, and it still hit her in the chest, the sheer scale of it, the way it made the air above their land feel occupied. Inhabited by something that had no awareness of them whatsoever, no malice, no intelligence, just appetite, just the sheer biological fact of millions of insects following their nature. They hit the corn like weather. The sound changed when they made contact with the plants, a tearing, stripping, crackling noise that was somehow worse than the flying sound, more specific, more urgent, like something being dismantled quickly by 10,000 hands. Maeve watched the edge of the swarm come down into the corn rows, and she felt her stomach drop, and then she was moving, already moving, because standing still was not an option. "Drive them toward the pens," she shouted. "Move!" She went into the corn, into it. The grasshoppers were on every surface instantly, on the stalks, on the leaves, on the ground, on her sleeves and her hat and her face, and she kept her mouth closed and her eyes down and moved through them because there was no alternative. Her boots crushed them with every step, and she felt them on her arms and her neck, and she kept moving. The birds heard the swarm before it arrived. She'd noticed this in the hour before impact, a change in the energy of the pens, a new alertness, the birds pressing toward the pen walls and their heads up, all facing the same direction. When the insects hit, the birds went into a feeding frenzy that she'd never seen in chickens before and would not have believed if she hadn't been there. Heads down, striking, striking, striking at the ground with a speed and focus that transformed them entirely from the confused, squabbling, sometimes stupid creatures she'd been nursing along for 2 months into something that looked more like a single coordinated machine. She opened the first pen. That had not been the original plan. The original plan was to keep the birds contained and move the pens, maintaining order, maintaining control. But she stood at the edge of that pen in the middle of a swarm so thick she could barely see 4 rows ahead, and she looked at the birds inside hammering at the wire walls trying to get to the insects outside. And she thought about the math one final time, and she pulled the panel pin and let 304 birds out into the Dakota morning. "Maeve!" Grant's voice from somewhere in the corn, alarmed. "I know," she called back. "Just trust me. Stay with the birds, keep them in the field. Don't let them run." There was a pause, and then she heard him moving, heard Tom Alderton swearing steadily and methodically somewhere to the north, heard James Haverford shouting something she couldn't make out. The birds spread through the corn rows like they'd been waiting their entire short lives for exactly this. They moved fast, faster than she'd seen them move, and they ate without stopping, and she moved with them, driving strays back toward the main group, shouting at them, waving her arms, covered in grasshoppers herself, because the swarm was on everything, including her, and she'd stopped trying to brush them off because it was pointless. They were everywhere. The air above the corn was dense with them. The stalks were thick with them. The ground was a moving carpet of them. She moved through her field fighting alongside her birds. Her hat went somewhere. She didn't know when. One moment it was on her head, and then it wasn't, and she didn't stop to look for it. She was bleeding from her right hand from catching a wire corner badly in the dark of the swarm, and she didn't know for how long because she hadn't noticed it until she saw blood on a corn stalk and realized it was coming from her, and she wrapped her hand in a piece of cloth she tore from her shirt hem and kept moving. Grant appeared out of the swarm with grasshoppers in his hair and on his shoulders, and his expression was the most focused she had ever seen it, stripped down to something elemental, and he said, "North fence. 3 birds got through. Leave them. I can get them back. Grant, stay in the field. The field." She grabbed his arm briefly, felt the insects on his sleeve under her palm. 3 birds aren't the crop. He held her eyes for a moment, nodded, turned back. The swarm stayed for 2 hours and 40 minutes. Maeve knew this because she counted. She counted in her head, running a clock, because she needed something to hold on to that was orderly while everything around her was not. She moved without stopping through those 2 hours and 40 minutes, through her field and back, driving birds, checking birds, losing birds to the chaos and the predators that came in behind the swarm. Hawks, 2 of them, riding the thermals above the insect mass and diving into the corn periodically, and losing her footing twice in the slippery mass of insects on the ground and going down on her hands and knees and getting up again. At some point in the second hour, she became aware that she was making a sound. Not words, something lower and steadier, a sound she wasn't quite controlling, that was coming out of her with each breath and that she couldn't have named if asked. She kept moving. The swarm began to thin before she noticed it ending. The density in the air above the corn dropped. The light came back by degrees. And then she realized she could see more than 4 rows ahead, could see to the fence line, could see Tom Alderton sitting on an overturned crate at the north edge of the field with his head down and Ned standing beside him. She stopped walking. She realized her legs were shaking. She stood in the middle of the corn and breathed and looked at what surrounded her. The corn was standing. Not all of it. There was damage. Stalks stripped of some leaves, the top sections of some plants badly eaten, the ground beneath the rows a thick mat of crushed insects and debris. But the stalks were standing. The ears, still forming, were on the stalks. The plants were damaged and they looked terrible, and they were alive. She turned in a slow circle, looking. The birds were scattered through the corn in the settling quiet, still eating, heads still down, moving slower now. She started counting and stopped herself because she didn't want to know the number yet. Not right now. That was tomorrow's math. Right now, she just needed to see what was left. James Haverford came out of the east rows covered in insects and dirt, with a cut above his eyebrow she doubted he'd noticed yet. He stopped when he saw her and looked at the corn around him and then looked at her. "It's standing," he said, like he didn't quite believe it. "Some of it," Maeve said. Her voice came out rough, like something had been scraped over it. "I mean, most of it." She looked at a stalk beside her, reached out and touched it, felt the solid living core of it beneath the damage. "Most of it," she agreed. Grant came through the rows and found her standing there with her hand on the stalk, and he looked at her for a long moment, and then he looked at the corn, and he didn't say anything. He came and stood beside her and put his hand on her shoulder, and she reached up and put her hand over his without turning around. And they stood like that in the wrecked and standing corn, while the last of the swarm moved north, and the hawks rode its edge, and the birds of the Whitlock farm ate their way steadily through what remained. She was going to have to count. She was going to have to assess the damage to the crop and count what was left of the flock and figure out where they stood. She was going to have to do all the math again, with new and worse numbers, and figure out how to make it work. But not yet. Not for another minute. She stood in her standing corn and let herself breathe. The count took 2 days. Not because the counting itself was complicated, but because the first time Maeve tried to do it, the morning after the swarm, before the light was fully up, moving through the corn rows with a tally she'd scratched into a piece of board, she got to 163 and had to stop. Not from exhaustion, though she was exhausted in a way that had moved past physical into something else entirely. She stopped because the number was worse than she'd braced for, and she needed a moment alone with it before she could bring it to Grant. 163 birds. Out of 304. Nearly half the flock. Gone. Some taken by hawks during the swarm, she'd seen that herself. Some that had run through the fence line in the chaos and hadn't come back. Some she found in the corn rows, still and small, lost in the violence and movement of 2 hours and 40 minutes of warfare that had been too much for a creature that weighed less than 2 pounds. She picked them up and set them at the row edges and kept counting, and the number kept being what it was. She didn't tell Grant that first morning. She finished her sweep, came back to the house, washed the cut on her hand with water that came out pink in the basin, and sat at the kitchen table with her tally board and looked at the number until it stopped being an emergency and became instead just a fact. A bad fact. A fact she could work with. Grant found her there. He'd been out checking the crop, actually looking at it in daylight for the first time since the swarm, assessing what had come through and what hadn't. He came in and stood in the kitchen doorway, and she could tell from his face that he'd also arrived at a number that was worse than he'd wanted. She showed him the tally board. He looked at it for a moment. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. He didn't say anything immediately, which she appreciated because there wasn't anything to immediately say. "The corn," she said. "How bad?" "Better than it looks," he said slowly. "Top leaves on maybe a third of the stalks, stripped or heavily damaged. Some of the north section got hit harder. I think the swarm came down heavier there, but the ears are still developing. Roots are fine. If we get rain in the next 2 weeks, I think we can still pull a reasonable harvest." "Beans?" "Some damage. Not as bad as the corn." "Garden?" His mouth tightened slightly. "The garden took a hit. Squash is gone. Turnips look okay. Most of the rest it's mixed." Maeve nodded. She was processing this alongside the bird count, running the numbers the way she always ran numbers, stacking what they had against what they needed. 163, she said. "That's still a working flock. It's not what I planned on, but it's enough," Grant said. Firmly, like he was closing a door on that particular line of worry. She looked at him. "You don't know that." "No," he agreed, "but I'm saying it anyway." She almost smiled. Didn't quite get there, but almost. "Well, The settlement came to them before Maeve and Grant came to the settlement. That was what she hadn't expected. She'd steeled herself for the walk to the trading post, the first face-to-face encounter with the neighbors who had spent 2 months calling her foolish, because the walk would have to happen eventually, and she was practical enough to get it over with. She'd been rehearsing it, the way you rehearse things you're not looking forward to, composing the version of herself she wanted to present. Not triumphant, she wasn't built for triumphant, just straightforward, steady, matter-of-fact about what had happened. But she didn't have to make that walk, because on the morning of the third day after the swarm, Elias Haverford came to her. She was in the corn checking plant health and tallying damage for her own records when she heard boots on the dry ground at the row edge, and she turned, expecting Grant or possibly James, and it was Elias. He was a large man, and he'd always carried himself with the kind of confidence that didn't leave much room for uncertainty, and she'd never seen him without that quality. She saw him without it now. He stood at the edge of her corn in the morning light, and he looked at the standing stalks around her, and then he looked at her, and his face had something in it she'd never seen there before. He didn't say anything right away. He seemed to be working up to something that was costing him more than usual. "Your corn is standing," he said finally. "Most of it," she said. "I walked mine this morning." He paused. "I walked what's left of it." She waited. "The swarm hit us harder than I've ever—" He stopped. Started again. "I've farmed this country for 9 years, and I've never seen anything move like that. Never seen it strip a field that fast." Another pause, longer. 60 acres of corn, Maeve. I'm going to pull maybe 15, if the weather cooperates." She didn't say anything. She didn't say "I told you," which was the thing she most wanted not to say, and also the thing that was most present in the air between them. "I owe you an apology," Elias Haverford said. The words came out with visible effort, like something being lifted that was heavier than he'd budgeted for. "I said some things about you, about Grant, that I had no business saying, and I said them where people could hear them." "Yes," Maeve said. "You did." He looked at her steadily. He'd expected that. "I was wrong about what you were doing. I didn't understand it, and I made assumptions." He looked at the corn again. "How did you know?" "I'd seen it before," she said, "when I was a child. And I watched the nymphs hatching in the south field back in April, and I knew what it meant. Nobody else saw that. Nobody else was looking for it." Elias was quiet for a moment. He was a man who didn't process humility quickly. You could see it moving through him in real time, the recalibration happening visibly in his expression. "I want to understand the pens," he said finally, "how they work, how you moved them. James told me something about it, but I want to hear it from you." She studied him. He was asking sincerely. She could tell the difference, had always been able to tell the difference. "Come back this afternoon," she said. "I'll show you what we built." He nodded, once, and walked back toward his land, and Maeve watched him go and felt a complicated thing that wasn't quite satisfaction and wasn't quite forgiveness, but was somewhere in the territory between them. Totech. He wasn't the only one who came. Over the following 4 days, 6 of the 14 families in the Whitmore settlement came to the Whitlock farm. Some of them together, some separately, all of them having lost significant portions of their crops, and all of them arriving with the same combination of humbled expression and urgent curiosity. Dora Selwick came with her husband Amos and stood in the field looking at the movable pens, which were battered and ugly after the swarm, some of them partially collapsed, none of them looking like something you'd point to as evidence of genius. And Amos Selwick, who had once told Grant his wife had talked him into something foolish, walked the length of the south pen in silence, and then turned to Maeve and said, "Can we buy some of your flock?" "Not yet," she said. "We'd pay a fair price." "It's not about price, Amos. I need every bird I have right now. But in the spring, if you want to set up a system of your own before planting, come talk to me." He looked like he wanted to push back and then thought better of it. She watched him recalculate his position in relation to hers and found the whole thing less satisfying than she might have imagined. Mostly it just made her tired in a different way than the physical work made her tired. Tom Alderton came back on the 4th day, this time without his boy, and he walked the field with Maeve for an hour asking questions that were specific and practical. Dimensions of the pens, weight, how many birds per pen gave the best coverage without overcrowding, how often to move them, how to handle predator incursion at night. He had a carpenter's mind, Tom, and he understood the structural logic of what she'd built and could see past the ugliness to the function beneath it.
"You'd build them differently," she said, watching him examine the frame joints on the east pen. "I'd square the corners properly," he said, "and I'd put a better mechanism on the bottom panel so you can drop it flat without lifting the whole frame. Would make it easier to move and easier to clean." He stood up from his crouch. "But what you made works. What you made saved your harvest." "What we made," she corrected. "You were here."
He shook his head. "I was here for the last 2 hours of it. You were here for 2 months. She didn't argue. It would have been false modesty, and she wasn't in the business of that. James Haverford came on his own on the 5th day, in the late afternoon, without his father knowing. She could tell he was without his father's knowledge by the way he came. Not through the main track, but along the creek side, quieter than you'd come if you were making a legitimate visit. He was 16, and he'd been raised by a man who'd spent 2 months publicly doubting everything Maeve had done, and he'd spent those 2 months watching her anyway. She respected that more than she could easily express. He sat on the fence rail at the edge of the south field and watched the birds working in the late light, and she stood nearby and let him think whatever he was thinking. "I want to do this on our land," he said finally, "next spring, before planting." "Does your pa know you're here?" He gave her a look. "What do you think?" "I think you should tell him," she said, "not because I care about whether Elias approves, but because doing it right means doing it when you can work openly, with the right materials, enough time to build properly. Sneaking around makes things harder." James scraped at the fence rail with his thumbnail, not looking at her. "He came home from here the other day and didn't say anything about it. Just sat at dinner and was quiet." A pause. "Pa's not good at being wrong, but he's not a bad man. He had 9 years of being right," Maeve said. "That's a hard habit to interrupt." The boy looked at her. "Are you defending him?" "I'm explaining him," she said. "There's a difference." He thought about that. "He's going to need to buy chicks if he wants to do this next year." "I'll have chicks to sell in the spring," she said. 163 hens producing well, that's a significant laying operation. And a flock that's proven itself against a Dakota grasshopper swarm is worth more than what you'd pay for unproven birds from a catalog. James was quiet again, looking out over the birds. "You thought of that already." "I think about most things already," she said. "It's a habit." He almost smiled. "Pa's going to come to you. I think he doesn't know how yet." "He'll figure it out when he's ready," she said. "People usually do." It was Grant who noticed her first, in the days after the swarm's aftermath settled into the new ordinary. He'd been watching her the way he sometimes watched her. Not constantly, not obviously, but with the particular attention of a man who knows someone well enough to see what they're not saying. She'd been fine, functionally. She'd been doing what needed doing, assessing the crop damage, managing the flock, talking to neighbors, calculating projections for fall income, keeping the birds fed and healthy and the pens repaired. She was doing all of it, and doing it competently, because competence was the thing she'd always been able to fall back on when everything else was uncertain. But she wasn't sleeping well. Grant brought it up on the 7th evening after dinner when she'd pushed her plate back and was sitting with her tally board again, working through numbers she'd already worked through twice. He reached across the table and put his hand on the board, gently, not pulling it away, but just stopping her. She looked up. "When did you last do something that wasn't this?" he said. She started to answer practically and then stopped, because the practical answer was that she hadn't, not in about 60 days, and she knew that was what he was asking about. "There isn't anything else right now," she said. "There's a walk," he said. "There's the creek." They're sitting on the porch for an hour without a tally board. He wasn't pushing, wasn't demanding, just laying it out in his quiet way. "You've been running on something empty for 2 months, and we came through it, and you haven't let yourself notice that we came through it." She looked at him across the table. "We lost 140 birds. We saved a crop. We kept the farm." He held her eyes. "We did the thing you thought we could do and nobody else thought we could do. And you're sitting here at 8 in the evening running the same numbers you've run every day for a week." She was quiet for a moment. The lamp between them threw uneven light across the table, and she could hear the birds settling in the modified pens outside. A comfortable sound, she'd come to realize over the past weeks. The sound of living things doing their ordinary work. "I'm scared to stop," she said finally, and she said it very quietly and to the table more than to Grant, which was as close as she got to admitting that kind of thing out loud. He didn't say anything immediately. He had the intelligence not to rush past what she'd just said. Of what? He asked after a moment. She thought about it honestly. That if I stop calculating, if I take a day away from managing every number and every variable, something will go wrong that I would have caught if I'd been paying attention. That I'll relax and then lose the rest of the flock to something I could have prevented. That 163 becomes 120 and then 100 and then something we can't come back from. Grant turned his coffee cup in his hands, the gesture he always made when he was thinking. You know that's not how it works. I know, she said. It doesn't stop me thinking it. We've got the best flock in the settlement right now, he said. We've got crops still standing when most of the farmers around us are looking at thin harvest numbers. We've got people coming to us to learn instead of to laugh. He paused. You did that. You're allowed to let it land. She didn't answer for a moment. It doesn't feel like a victory, she said. It feels like we survived. There's a difference. There is, he agreed. But surviving something this hard is worth a minute of not calculating. I'm not asking you to stop. I'm asking you to take a walk with me before dark. She looked at him. At the lines around his eyes that were deeper than when she'd married him. At the hands wrapped around the cup that had spent 2 months hauling water and building pens and dragging frames through Dakota dirt alongside hers. He was right, and she knew he was right, and she was going to resist for approximately another 15 seconds before giving in because she had an enormous amount of willpower. And it did not, it turned out, extend to Grant Whitlock, asking her to take a walk in the evening. She pushed back her chair. One walk, she said. One walk, he agreed, already standing. But they walked the south field as the light went flat and amber, side by side without talking, and the corn stood around them in the still evening air, damaged and scarred and stripped in places, leaves gone from the top thirds of stalks that had held on through the swarm's passing, the evidence of what had happened written clearly in every row. It didn't look like a victory. It looked like a field that had been through something terrible and had come out on the other side still standing by the skin of its teeth. She stopped in the middle of the south row and stood looking at a stalk beside her. It had survived. The ear on it was still forming. The damage was visible in every detail. Half its leaves stripped, the remaining ones ragged, the stalk itself mottled where insects had crawled over it in their millions. But the core was solid under her hand when she touched it, the way it had been after the swarm passed, alive in its damaged way, still working. She thought about her father, his field in Ohio, stripped to mud in 6 hours, and what it had done to him. Not the loss of the crop alone, which would have been survivable, but the specific quality of helplessness in it, the way it had happened to him without his participation, without any action he'd taken or failed to take, making any difference at all. The swarm had come and taken everything, and there had been nothing to do but watch. That hadn't happened here. She hadn't been able to stop the swarm. She'd never claimed she could stop the swarm. But she'd been able to do something, and the doing of something had mattered, and the field around her was the proof of it, damaged and standing. She stood there with her hand on the cornstalk, and she thought about that, and she felt something that she didn't have a clean word for. A settling, maybe. The feeling of something that had been braced finally allowed to come down. Grant stood nearby, not crowding her, giving her the space to do whatever she was doing. Okay, she said after a while. Okay, he said. I think I can eat dinner tomorrow without running numbers in my head at the same time. High ambitions, he said, dry as the Dakota air. She took her hand off the stalk, and they walked back toward the house in the last of the light, and the birds were settling in their pens in the blue dusk on both sides of the path, and somewhere on the Haverford land to the north there was a lantern burning in a window, and the settlement was quiet around them in the way it was quiet after something hard had passed through and left people to reckon with what remained. Maeve walked beside her husband and felt the weight of what she'd built. Not just the pens, not just the system, but the 2 months of work and worry and calculation and stubbornness that had gone into it, felt the weight of it, and for the first time allowed herself to think that it had been worth it. Not triumphantly, not loudly, just quietly, walking through the dusk with Grant's shoulder occasionally touching hers, looking at her damaged and standing farm. She wasn't done calculating. She'd never be done calculating. That was just who she was, and she'd long since made her peace with it. But the number she kept coming back to tonight, walking back to the house in the settling dark, wasn't birds or dollars or bushels. It was 14 families in the Whitmore settlement, and of those 14, 6 had come to her door in the past week with their hats in their hands and their eyes open. That was a number she hadn't planned on when she'd counted out $18 on Rutherford Calhoun's counter. She filed it away. She'd figure out what it meant later. Right now, she followed the path home through the cooling evening and let herself, for 1 hour, just be here. The harvest came in August, and it was not a good harvest. Maeve had known it wouldn't be. She'd done the crop assessment 3 times over the course of July, walking every row, measuring damage against growth, watching the ears fill out on the surviving stalks with the careful attention of someone who needed to know the exact size of the thing she was working with. She'd arrived at her number before the harvest started, and the harvest confirmed it, roughly 60% of what a normal year would have produced. Enough. Not comfortable. Not the kind of number that let you breathe easy going into winter, but enough. Around them, the settlement was in far worse shape. The Haverford farm pulled a quarter of what Elias had projected in the spring. The Selwicks lost most of their corn entirely and were banking on their bean crop to get them through, and the bean crop was thin. 2 of the smaller homesteads to the southeast had losses so severe that the families were already making decisions about whether to stay through another winter or pack what remained and head back east to relatives who might or might not be willing to absorb them. Those conversations happened quietly, the way the hard ones always did in small settlements, but Maeve heard about them through the ordinary channels of community information, the kind of news that moved from person to person, not because people were cruel, but because everyone needed to know the shape of what was happening around them. The shape of what was happening in the Whitmore settlement in the autumn of 1887 was this. The families that had survived best were the ones with the most diversified operations going into the swarm. The families that had put everything into grain crops were the ones now doing the hardest arithmetic about their futures. Maeve was aware, very aware, in the particular way she was always aware of things before she could fully articulate them, that what she did with this information mattered. Not just for practical reasons, but for the kind of reasons that were harder to calculate, the relational ones, the ones that had to do with who the Whitlocks were going to be in this community going forward. She had been right when the neighbors were wrong, and being right when your neighbors are wrong is a delicate thing to carry. She'd seen what happened to people who carried it badly. She talked to Grant about it one evening in early August, sitting on the porch with the cooling air coming off the fields and the harvest noise, wagons, voices, the specific sounds of late summer work, drifting across from neighboring land. Elias is going to come to us, she said, about the chicks, about next spring. He already came to you once, Grant said. He came to apologize and to understand what we did. That's different from coming to buy something. She turned her coffee cup in her hands. When he comes to buy, he's going to need to do it in a way that doesn't feel like defeat. That matters to him. And I think how we handle it is going to matter to everyone watching. Grant looked at her sideways. What are you thinking? I'm thinking we don't wait for him to come to us. I'm thinking we go to him. A pause. And say what? Say we want to put a proposal together for next spring. A cooperative arrangement. Multiple farms running the pen system, sharing the labor of building and moving pens, pooling resources for chick purchases to bring the cost per bird down. She paused. Make it about the settlement, not about us having something they need to come beg for. Grant was quiet, thinking. That's generous. It's practical, she said. A stronger settlement is better for us than a weaker one. We're not in competition with the Haverfords. We're all trying to do the same thing in the same hard country. Some people don't see it that way. Some people are wrong, she said. Again. He made a sound that was almost a laugh. He stood up from his chair and looked out over the fields for a moment. When? End of harvest, she said. Let everyone get through their numbers first. Then we ask Elias and Tom and whoever else wants in to come have a conversation. Not at the trading post, Grant said. Here. She nodded. Here, duck to it. The harvest wrapped in the 3rd week of August with the particular exhaustion that came at the end of a growing season that had asked everything of everyone and given back varying amounts. The Whitlock's 60% yield translated to a specific dollar figure when Maeve ran it against the commodity prices that Calhoun had posted at the trading post, and the figure was, as she'd assessed, enough. Their egg production from the surviving 163 hens had also been producing steadily since July.
more steadily than she'd projected because the summer heat had not been as hard on the flock as she'd feared, and the eggs were selling at the trading post and to 3 of the neighboring families at a price that was adding a quiet, reliable income stream to the farm's numbers for the first time in the Whitlock's 4 years on this land.
She laid it all out one evening at the kitchen table. The crop income, the egg income, the projected chick sales for spring, the costs of the past season, and looked at the final number for a long time. They were not out of danger. One good season did not eliminate the underlying fragility of a Dakota homestead in the 1880s, which was a fragility built into the land itself and the weather and the market prices for grain that moved according to forces happening in cities 500 miles away. But the number on her tally board was no longer a number that required her to run emergency calculations in the middle of the night. It was a number with a small margin, a thin buffer against the next bad thing that came along. She stared at it for a while, and then she put the board away in the drawer where she kept her tallies, and she went outside and stood in the yard in the late evening air and just breathed. Grant found her there a few minutes later. He didn't ask what she was thinking. He just stood beside her. "We're okay," she said. "For now." "For now," he agreed, not dismissing it, just being precise. "That'll do," she said. "All do." The meeting happened on a Saturday evening in the last days of August, after the work of the week was done and before people started thinking seriously about the preparations that needed to happen before first frost. Maeve had sent word through Tom Alderton, who had the trust of most of the settlement in the particular way that a man who fixed things tended to acquire trust, not through charisma or authority, but through reliability, through being the person who showed up when things needed mending. Tom had spoken to Elias Haverford and to the Selwicks and to the Brennan family whose farm sat at the western edge of the settlement and who had lost nearly everything to the swarm. 6 families came. They sat in the Whitlock house and on the porch and on chairs that had been pulled outside into the yard, 8 adults and 3 of the older children who'd been involved in one way or another in the work of the summer. James Haverford sat on the porch rail with his long legs dangling and said nothing. But Maeve was aware that he heard everything. She let Grant open it. She was the one who'd thought of it and planned it and would carry most of the weight of executing it. But Grant had a steadiness that people responded to, a plainness that read as trustworthy, and she understood the difference between having the right idea and being the right person to introduce it. "We're not here to sell you anything," Grant said at the start. He was standing in the yard, hands in his pockets, talking to the group the way he talked to anyone, level, direct, without performance. "We're here because we had a hard summer, and everybody in this room had a hard summer, and it seems like if we'd been doing this together from the start, we might all have come through it in better shape. So Maeve has a thought about next spring, and we wanted to hear what people think. Simple." She took it from there. She explained the cooperative arrangement in plain terms. A shared purchase of chicks in early spring, which would bring the cost per bird down significantly from what she'd paid to the Millhaven seller. A shared pen-building effort in March and April, with Tom Alderton as the construction lead because he'd already identified improvements to her original design that would make the pens more effective. And a shared labor system during the field working season, rotating help between farms so that no single family was trying to run a moving pen system alone while also managing all their other work. She explained it for about 10 minutes, clearly, without overselling. Then she stopped talking and let the room be quiet for a moment. Amos Selwick spoke first, which she hadn't expected. He'd been the one to say foolish about her in Calhoun's trading post and the one to come to her door after the swarm wanting to buy her birds. And in the intervening weeks, she'd watched him recalibrate his position with the slightly pained expression of a man who prided himself on his judgment and was being forced to revise it upward for someone he'd misjudged. He wasn't graceful about it, but he was trying. "The cost on the birds," he said. "You'd manage the purchase?" "We'd manage it together," she said. "One order, split proportionally. Everyone puts in according to what they can afford and what scale of operation they're planning." "And if a family can only afford a small number of birds," he said, "they're not locked out?" "No. Even a small flock working your fields is better than none. The system scales." She looked at him steadily. "You're not too late to this, Amos. That's what I'm trying to say. Anyone who wants in next spring, we start in March, there's time to do it right." Amos nodded slowly. Elias Haverford had been quiet. He was sitting on one of the chairs that had been pulled into the yard, large and still. And Maeve had been aware of him the entire time she'd been talking, aware of him the way you're aware of a weather system, something significant whose direction you're watching. He'd come to her field in the early days after the swarm, and he'd done it with genuine humility, and she'd respected it. But this was different. This was a public thing, a group thing, and Elias Haverford's relationship with public things had always been about being the one who knew what he was talking about. When he spoke, his voice was measured. "I'll be honest with you," he said. "I spent 9 years thinking I knew this land. I know the soil, I know the weather patterns, I know what works and what doesn't work." A pause. "I didn't know this. I didn't see it coming, and I didn't believe it when you said it was coming, and I paid for that this summer. My family paid for it." He looked at Maeve directly. "I'm in. Whatever you need from the Haverford land, you've got it."
The yard was quiet for a moment. Then Tom Alderton said, "I'd like to talk about the pen design. I've got some ideas about the corner joints." And the conversation shifted from the moment into the practical, which was exactly where Maeve wanted it. Thus,
what she hadn't planned on, and what happened anyway, the way things tend to happen when you've set something in motion and then stepped back from it, was James Haverford. He stayed after the other families left, which she noticed because he'd arrived with his father and didn't leave with him. Elias walked back to their land with a nod to Maeve that carried more in it than it showed, and James stayed sitting on the porch rail until the yard was clear and then climbed down and came to where she was stacking chairs back inside. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You usually do," she said. He almost smiled. He was 16 and he stood with his father's width in the shoulders and something entirely his own in his face, a quality of attention that was going to serve him well in his life if he didn't talk himself out of it. "Why a cooperative? You could have just sold chicks. You'd make more money that way." She set a chair down and looked at him. "Probably," she said, "in the short term. So why not?" She thought about how to say it, not the easy version, not the inspirational version, but the actual reason. "Because this settlement survives, or it doesn't as a whole," she said. "If the Haverfords and the Selwicks and the Brennans have bad years and bad years again after that, they leave. And when enough people leave, the mill closes, and then the trading post, and then the track maintenance stops getting done. And then we're alone out here with 320 acres and no infrastructure, and that's not survivable either." She picked up another chair. "I'm not being noble. I'm being practical. A stronger community is worth more to me than whatever I'd make selling chicks at a higher margin." James was quiet, turning this over. "Pa doesn't think that way." "Your pa is starting to," she said. "He's just not there yet." "You think he'll get there?" "I think tonight was a pretty significant step." She moved past him toward the door. People change when the evidence makes it too expensive not to. He followed her inside, picked up a chair without being asked, and helped her move furniture back where it belonged, and they worked in comfortable silence for a few minutes, the way she and Grant worked, and she found herself thinking that James Haverford was going to be a different kind of farmer than his father, and that the difference was going to be good for whoever ended up farming alongside him. September came in dry and cool, and the settlement moved into the work of preparation for winter with the particular focused energy that came when people had been scared enough to stop taking anything for granted. There was a different quality in the Whitmore settlement that fall, something Maeve felt at the trading post and on the track when neighbors passed and stopped to talk, a quality of mutual recognition that hadn't been there in the spring. They had been through something together, even the families that had refused to participate in what she'd done until after the fact, and surviving something together changed the texture of a community in ways that were hard to articulate but easy to feel. She and Grant worked through September with the sustained pace of people who had too much to do and had made their peace with that fact. The pens needed winterizing, the canvas needed patching, the wire needed checking for spots where the summer's hard use had weakened it. Several frame members needed replacing before they failed in cold weather. They built a proper winter shelter for the flock, not elaborate, but insulated better than anything they'd had before, because 163 birds was a real operation now, and keeping them healthy through a Dakota winter was not something she was going to leave to chance. The egg income continued. This was the part that still slightly surprised her, the steadiness of it. Not dramatic, not transformative on its own, but reliable in a way that grain crops could never quite be, because grain happened once a year and eggs happened every day. Calhoun had started setting a weekly order with her, a guaranteed purchase that she could plan around, and 2 of the settlement families had arrangements to buy directly. She'd begun keeping a separate ledger just for the poultry operation, which was a thing she'd never imagined needing when she'd loaded 342 baby chicks onto a wagon in April. One afternoon in mid-September, Rutherford Calhoun stopped her in the trading post when she was picking up her weekly supplies. "I had a man come through here last week," he said. He said it in the careful way he had when he was leading up to something. "Traveling merchant, comes through twice a year. I was telling him about what happened here this summer with the swarm." "And?" she said. "He sells agricultural equipment and seed, carries catalogs, connects buyers and sellers, that kind of thing." Calhoun paused. "He asked me a lot of questions about the movable pen system, how it worked, what it was made of, how many farms were using it." Another pause. He asked who developed it. Maeve looked at him. "I told him your name," Calhoun said. "I hope that's all right." She thought about that for a moment. "What did he say?" "He said he'd be back through in November. He said he'd like to talk to you." Calhoun picked up a pencil and turned it in his fingers. He seemed like a serious man, the kind that doesn't waste time on things that aren't worth his time. She picked up her supplies and paid for them and walked out into the September afternoon, and she stood for a moment on the wooden sidewalk in front of the trading post and looked out at the settlement around her, the track, the mill in the distance, the fields stretching out on both sides with their post-harvest emptiness, the particular flatness of the land in September when the growing season was over and the land showed its real character again, vast and dry and patient. A merchant, coming through in November, asking about the pen system, asking who'd developed it. She filed it away. She had plenty of other things to manage between now and November, and she was not in the habit of counting things she didn't have yet. But she filed it in the part of her mind where she kept possibilities, the corner of the ledger that didn't have numbers in it yet, but that she kept ready, kept space for, because in 4 years of homesteading, she'd learned that the things you didn't plan for were sometimes the ones that mattered most. She walked back to the wagon. Grant was loading the last of the supplies from Calhoun's, and he looked up when she came around the corner, reading her expression the way he'd learned to read it over 4 years. "What?" he said. "Nothing yet," she said. Possibly something in November." He waited. "Calhoun says a traveling merchant wants to talk to me," she said, "about the pen system." Grant loaded a sack and straightened up. He was quiet for a moment, looking at her with the expression she recognized as him, thinking about something he wasn't going to say until he'd thought it through fully. "How do you feel about that?" he asked. It was such a Grant Whitlock question. Practical on the surface and underneath it something entirely human, asking not about the logistics, but about her. She considered it honestly. "Uncertain," she said. "Curious." She climbed up onto the wagon seat. "Ask me in November." He climbed up beside her and they turned the wagon and headed back along the track toward home, the settlement sitting quiet and familiar around them, and Maeve felt the full strange weight of where they'd ended up since April. The same land, the same 320 acres, the same hard country that had been working against them since they'd arrived, but something fundamentally different in how they stood on it. Not comfortable, not safe, not in the way that word meant in easier places, but steady. Something that had been tested and had held. She watched the road ahead and let herself sit with that for a moment. Just that, while the wagon moved and the fall light came at a low angle across the fields, and somewhere ahead the farm waited with its winter work and its 163 birds, and the small, careful margin they'd scratched out of the wreckage of a summer that should have broken them. It hadn't broken them. She was still working out what that meant, what it changed, what it made possible. She suspected she'd be working it out for a while yet. The wagon moved through the afternoon, and the settlement fell away behind them, and they drove home through the Dakota September with the particular companionable quiet of 2 people who had said most of what needed saying and were still here. The merchant's name was Edwin Pross, and he arrived on a Tuesday in the second week of November when the ground had its first serious frost on it, and the Whitlock farm was deep in the quiet work of winter preparation. Maeve had almost stopped thinking about him. Not entirely. She'd filed the possibility away in September, the way she filed most things, in the back corner of a mind that was always running multiple tracks simultaneously. But October had been full, and November had come in cold and demanding, and a merchant who might or might not return was a long way down the list of things she was actively managing. So when Calhoun sent his boy out to the farm on Monday afternoon with a note saying Pross had come through and was asking after her, she felt something that was mostly surprise and only partly the other thing, the cautious flicker of possibility she'd been keeping banked since September. She rode into the settlement the next morning and found him at the trading post. Edwin Pross was not what she'd constructed in her mind during the weeks of not quite thinking about him. She'd imagined someone loud, someone with the particular performed confidence of a traveling salesman, which was a type she'd encountered enough times to have a clear internal picture of. Pross was none of that. He was slight, maybe 50, with the kind of face that had been weathered by a lot of time on the road. Not dramatically, but in the way that movement and exposure and dealing with people across 100 different situations left a mark. He had careful eyes, and he was writing something in a small notebook when she came in, and he looked up without rushing when Calhoun introduced her. "Mrs. Whitlock," he said, "thank you for coming in." "Calhoun said you had questions," she said. "I have a lot of questions," he said, "if you have the time." She did. She sat down across from him at the small table Calhoun kept near the back of the trading post, and Pross opened his notebook, and she noticed it was dense with writing, small and precise. The notebook of a man who paid attention and wrote down what he noticed. He asked about the pen system for 40 minutes. Not the general shape of it, he'd gotten that from Calhoun, but the specifics, the things that only came from having actually done it. The dimensions that worked best for different field row width, the weight limit before a pen became too heavy to move daily. How many birds per square foot of pen floor gave adequate coverage without crowding that led to stress and mortality? How she'd managed predator pressure at night in open field conditions. What she'd learned about timing, when to start moving birds into the field in spring, how to track the nymph hatch to know where to concentrate the flock. She answered everything directly, and she noticed about halfway through that she was enjoying the conversation, which was an unexpected thing to notice. Not because she was unused to being asked about the system. She'd answered questions about it all summer and into fall. But because Pross was asking at a level of specificity that nobody in the settlement had reached, and answering at that level required her to articulate things she'd mostly carried around as instinct. When he stopped writing, he put his pencil down and looked at her. "There are farmers in Nebraska who lost significant acreage to the same swarm," he said. "It was a wide system. Came through the territory in a band and hit hard across multiple settlements." He paused. "The farmers who had nothing like what you built lost nearly everything. I talked to 3 of them on my way through." "I know," she said. "We heard about the Nebraska losses. What you've described is a working system. Not theoretical, not a plan. A working system that produced results in direct field conditions during a significant infestation event." He held her gaze. "There are people I work with, these equipment supplier, seed distributors, agricultural cooperatives, who would be interested in this. Not just as information, as a product. A designed, buildable pen system with instructions and specifications that could be sold to farming communities across the territory." She looked at him. She'd had an inkling that something like this might be where the conversation was going, but hearing it said plainly still required a moment of sitting with it. "You're talking about selling the design," she said. "Selling access to the design," he said. "You'd retain what you built. What you'd share is the documented system, dimensions, materials, the management approach, the seasonal timing. A guide that lets another farmer replicate what you did without having to figure it out themselves from scratch, the way you did. And who pays for that? The cooperatives and suppliers I work with. They'd pay you a licensing fee for the right to distribute the documentation as part of their service to member farms." He said a number. She kept her face even. The number was not large in absolute terms. It was not the kind of number that transformed everything immediately. But it was money for something she'd already built, already proven, and it came with the implication of being paid again as additional distributions went out. "I'd need to see the terms in writing," she said. "Of course," he said. "I'll have a document prepared. Nothing binds until you've read it and agreed." She looked at the table for a moment, then back at him. "Can I ask you something?" "Please," he said. "How many other farms have you seen do anything like this? The movable pen approach? Using chickens for grasshopper management?" He considered the question seriously, which she appreciated. "I've been traveling this territory for 18 years, he said. "I've seen farmers try chickens for pest management before. Stationary flocks, mostly. Some people have lost birds to grasshopper infestations when they tried to run open-range birds during swarm events. He picked up his pencil again, tapped it against the notebook. What you built, the movable structure, the systematic field coverage, the timing against the nymph cycle, I haven't seen this before. Not assembled the way you assembled it. She nodded. She didn't say anything. You had no template, he said. It wasn't quite a question. I had a memory, she said, and a mathematical problem I needed to solve. He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was harder to read than the rest of the conversation had been. Then he wrote something in his notebook and closed it. I'll have a document ready before I leave Thursday, he said. Read it carefully. Take your time. If the terms aren't right, tell me specifically what would make them right, and we'll see what we can do. She stood up and pulled on her coat. I'll read it, she said, and I'll bring my husband. Of course, Pross said. She rode home through the November cold with the conversation sitting in her chest, and her mind already running, already calculating, already doing what it always did. She tried, consciously, to do what Grant had asked her to do back in June, to let the thing land before she analyzed it. She lasted about 4 minutes. Then she gave up and let her mind run, because that was who she was, and she'd made her peace with it long since. Grant read the document twice, slowly, on Wednesday evening, while Maeve sat across the table and worked on her winter accounts, and tried not to watch him read. He set it down. He looked at the ceiling for a moment the way he did when he was thinking something through to its end. It's fair, he said. The terms are fair. I think so too. The licensing structure means if they distribute it more widely, you see more from it. Yes. He looked at her. You want to do this. She set her pencil down. I want to understand what it means before I decide if I want to do it. Those are different things. What does it mean? He said. Not challenging, genuinely asking her to think out loud, which was something he'd always been good at making space for. She thought about it honestly. It means what we've figured out here this summer doesn't stay here, she said. It goes somewhere else, to farms we'll never see, to people dealing with the same problems we dealt with, and they don't have to start from scratch the way we did. She paused. That matters to me. I didn't expect it to matter to me as much as it does, but it does. The money helps, Grant said, practical. The money helps, she agreed. But it's not only the money. He was quiet for a moment. You're thinking about your father. She looked at him. Sometimes his ability to locate the things she hadn't said out loud startled her still, after 4 years. His field in Ohio was stripped bare, and he couldn't do anything, she said. He stood there and watched it happen, and there was nothing. No system, no knowledge, nothing he could do to change the outcome. And it took something out of him. She looked at the document on the table. If one farmer in Nebraska reads what we put together and saves his crop next summer, that's worth something to me that isn't in the licensing fee. Grant looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. Sign it, he said. We both sign it, she said. It's our farm. It's your idea. It's our farm, she said again firmly. He nodded. All right, we both sign it. Edwin Pross left on Thursday morning with a signed document in his bag and Maeve's detailed notes, dimensions, materials list, timing guide, management practices, written out in her small, careful hand over 3 evenings, tucked in a separate folder. He shook Grant's hand and Maeve's hand at the trading post and said he'd be in touch by spring with the first distribution report, and then he climbed onto his wagon and headed south out of the settlement and disappeared around the tree line. Maeve watched him go from in front of the trading post and felt the particular strange lightness that came after a decision was made and set in motion and was no longer something she could revise. Not regret. She was certain about this. She'd been doing the math on it for 2 days and the math was clear. Just the finality of it, the way a signed document turned a possibility into a fact. Calhoun came out to stand beside her, which she hadn't expected. You did something good there, he said. I sold something, she said. You sold something that helps people, he said. There's a difference. He went back inside. She stood there for another moment in the November cold, then went to find Grant, who was at the mill talking to Tom Alderton about something or other, and she found them both crouched over a piece of paper that turned out to be Tom's revised pen design. The squared corners, the improved bottom panel, the modifications he'd been developing since August. "This is what we're building in March," Tom said, without looking up from the paper when she came in. "I want to make 20 of these before planting. If we're going to do the cooperative right, we need enough units to cover 6 farms without everyone waiting on each other." "That's a lot of building," Maeve said. "That's why I'm starting to plan it now," Tom said. She looked at the design over his shoulder. It was better than what she'd built. Significantly better, cleaner, more functional. The kind of thing you got when someone with actual carpentry skill took a working idea and refined it. She felt no particular bruise to her pride about this, which she noted with mild surprise. It was just good. Better was better. "When's the first community planning meeting?" she asked. "I was thinking January," Tom said. "Give people time to get through the holidays and figure out what they want to commit to." "January," she agreed. Grant caught her eye over Tom's head, and she saw something in his expression that she recognized as him being pleased about something, and she understood without him saying it that he was pleased about this, about Tom Alderton with his carpenter's mind improving her design, about the meeting in January, about the thing she'd started that had moved beyond her now and taken on its own momentum. She understood why he was pleased. She was pleased too, though pleased was not quite the right word, more like settled, like something had found its shape. Winter came in hard the first week of December, which in the Whitmore settlement meant hard work and close quarters, and the particular intimacy of people doing what needed doing in cold and dark. The Whitlock farm went into its winter rhythms. The birds in their insulated shelter tended twice daily. The accounts and plans and correspondence that accumulated during the busy months and got worked through in the quieter ones. The ordinary maintenance of a farm and a household and a life. Maeve wrote to her mother in Ohio for the first time in 8 months. She'd been a bad correspondent since coming west. Not from lack of care, but from lack of time and the specific exhaustion that left her too depleted at day's end to want to write letters. She sat down in December and wrote 7 pages, which was more than she'd written at one go in years, and she told her mother about the spring and the decision to spend $18 on baby chicks and the summer and the swarm and what came after. She didn't write it as a triumph. She wrote it as what it had been. A gamble that came from fear and memory and the particular mathematics of a situation with no good options that had worked out in a way she'd worked very hard to make work out, and that had cost them things, birds, sleep, certainty, the comfortable assumption that hard work was enough to protect you from what the land could do. She wrote it honestly, and she wrote about what it had felt like to stand in the corn after the swarm passed and feel the living core of a stalk that had made it through, and what it had felt like to count 163 birds in the settling quiet and know that was what they had to build from. Her mother wrote back in January, a letter that arrived on a particularly cold Thursday with frozen mud on the envelope from the postal route. Her mother was not an effusive woman. They were alike in that, Maeve had always known it. But she wrote, "Your father would have understood what you did, Maeve. He would have been glad someone found the answer he never got to find." Maeve read it once at the kitchen table and then folded it and put it away in the drawer with her tallies. She didn't take it out again, but she knew where it was, and that was enough. The January meeting brought 8 of the 14 settlement families, which was more than Maeve had projected and which required Tom Alderton to bring in chairs from the mill. They sat in the Whitlock house, and Maeve walked them through the spring plan. Pen construction starting in March, chick order going out at the end of February, field deployment beginning in April. And Tom presented his revised design with the manner of a man who had been waiting several months to show people something he was quietly proud of, which was accurate. Elias Haverford sat in the front and asked questions throughout, substantive ones, the questions of a man who was taking this seriously and had done his thinking beforehand. At one point he asked about pen density per acre. How many birds did you need working a given area to achieve adequate coverage against a nymph population? And the question was specific enough that Maeve had to pull out her notes to answer it precisely, which she did. And when she looked up, she saw James Haverford watching his father with an expression she couldn't quite read, something between recognition and something else. After the meeting, when people were filing out into the January cold and the conversation was breaking into smaller pieces, Elias came to stand near Maeve in a way that was deliberate, the way he did things, with intention, because he wasn't a man who drifted into proximity by accident. "I want to put in for 50 birds," he said. "My share of the cooperative order." 50 is a solid start for your acreage, she said. A pause. He was looking at the place where the meeting had been, at the chairs being put back, at the lamp-lit room. I've been thinking about what you said to James, he said. Last summer. About 9 years of being right. She waited.
That was fair, he said. I don't like it, but it was fair. He looked at her. I've been farming this land for 9 years, and I got comfortable with what I knew. I stopped looking for what I didn't know. Another pause, harder. You were 24 years old, and you saw something I didn't see, and you were right about it. That's something I'm going to have to sit with for a while. She looked at him steadily. Elias, she said, you came to my field when you didn't have to. You came to this meeting. You're in the cooperative. She paused. Most people don't do all of that. He looked at the floor briefly, then back at her. Most people don't make it easy to. No, she said. They don't. He nodded once, put on his hat, and went out into the cold. Spring came the way it always came to the Dakota Territory. Not gently, not with the soft, progressive warming that people back east described, but in fits, warm days and frozen nights, and mud that sucked at boots and wagon wheels, and then brief cold snaps that made you feel like winter had changed its mind. The pen construction started in March as planned, with Tom Alderton running the operation from the mill yard on the weekends, and the sound of hammering and the smell of cut lumber became the particular background music of March in the Whitmore settlement. Maeve was part of this construction crew and not the lead of it, which was a new and slightly strange experience. Tom knew what he was doing with the revised design, and he had apprenticed several of the settlement men into the specifics of it, and Maeve's role was mostly consultation, answering questions, checking dimensions against her field experience, occasionally pointing out something in a prototype that didn't match how birds actually behaved in a field pen. She was useful in that role, and she understood its limits, which was its own kind of knowledge. The chick order arrived in the last week of March. 390 birds for the cooperative, plus the Whitlock Farm's own addition to their existing flock. Another 80 birds to bring their operation back toward its summer capacity. Maeve stood at the trading post when the crates came in on the supply wagon and looked at the sound and movement of nearly 500 baby chicks, and felt something that was specifically not nostalgia, because she was not a person given to nostalgia, but was something adjacent to it, a recognition. The smell of baby birds and fresh sawdust, the thin, urgent peeping, the specific weight of a crate being lifted. Grant stood beside her. Bigger than last year, he said. Everything is bigger than last year, she said. They loaded their portion and drove home through the March mud, and the chicks rode in the back of the wagon and made their noise, and Maeve sat on the wagon seat and felt the year beginning around her, the land returning to itself, the fields waiting, the endless pragmatic machinery of another growing season engaging. The first letter from Edwin Pross arrived in April. Brief, businesslike, reporting that the documentation had gone out to 3 agricultural cooperatives in Nebraska and Kansas, totaling an initial distribution to 47 farms. The licensing payment was included, a bank draft that she and Grant deposited at the settlement's nearest bank on their next trip to the larger town to the south. She held the draft for a moment before handing it over. 47 farms, 47 people she'd never meet, reading something she'd written at the kitchen table in December by lamplight, trying to make sense of what she'd figured out over 2 months of exhaustion and lost birds and standing corn. She hoped it was clear enough. She'd tried to make it clear. Summer came and the nymphs hatched, and the cooperative ran its pens through the settlement fields, and the work of it was different this time. Not easier. Work like this was never easy, but less isolated. Grant worked alongside Tom Alderton on the north fields some days, and James Haverford worked the Whitlock south fields twice a week in exchange for Maeve's guidance on bird management, and the movement of pens across the settlement's fields was a shared operation now, rather than a single family's desperate private gamble. There was no swarm in 1888. The grasshopper population was present but manageable, and the cooperative's birds moved through the nymph hatch in May and June and reduced the infestation to a level that the crops could survive without catastrophe. Nobody could say for certain that a swarm would have come if they'd done nothing. That was the nature of prevention, that it erased the evidence of its own necessity. But the nymph counts Maeve had been running all spring told their own story,
and by June the count was down to a fraction of what it had been the previous year. She walked the south field in July and looked at the corn. Full canopy. Healthy ears. The particular thick green of a crop that had not been fighting for its life. She stood in the middle of the row and breathed the green smell of it and felt the sun on her face and thought about nothing in particular for a few minutes, which was something she was getting better at. James Haverford found her there, which had become something of a pattern. He was 17 now, broader, with the beginning of his father's authority in the way he moved. He came down the row and stopped near her and looked at the corn with a farmer's eye, which was different from a boy's eye, and she could see the difference. "Good stand," he said. "Good stand," she agreed. "Pa said to tell you the north field is looking the same." A pause. "He said it himself. He told me to tell you." She understood what that meant. Elias Haverford delivering a compliment through his son rather than directly, because direct was still hard for him, but he was trying. She felt a warmth toward the man that surprised her with its sincerity. "Tell him the feeling is mutual," she said. James nodded. He looked at the corn for another moment. "Can I ask you something?" "You always do," she said, same as she'd said the last time. "Last year, when you spent the $18 on the chicks." He stopped, organizing the question. "Were you scared?" She looked at him. He was asking seriously, the way he asked things, and he deserved a serious answer. "Yes," she said. "I was terrified." "But you did it anyway." "I did it anyway," she said. "Because the math said it was the least bad option, and because I'd seen what doing nothing looked like, and that was worse." She paused, thinking about how to say the next part honestly without making it sound tidy, because it hadn't been tidy. Being scared doesn't mean you're wrong. Sometimes it means you're paying attention. He turned this over. He'd be farming his father's land in a few years and then eventually his own, and she was aware that she was talking to someone who was going to carry whatever she said into decisions she'd never see. "The thing that gets people," she said, after a moment, "is thinking that uncertainty means stop, that if you can't be sure, you should wait until you are sure. But you're never sure. You work with what you know and what you can see and what your gut tells you, and you make the best call you can, and then you do the work." She looked at the corn. "The work is the thing you can control. The rest of it, weather, swarms, prices, what the land does, you can't control any of that. But you can control whether you did everything you could with what you had." James was quiet. "Did you always know it would work?" he asked. "No," she said, flat and honest. "I didn't know. I thought I was right. I hoped I was right, but I didn't know." He nodded slowly. Something settled in his face, something that had been slightly tense releasing, like he'd been bracing himself for a version of the story that was cleaner than this, and was relieved to hear the real one. "Thank you," he said. "Go check on your birds," she said. He went. The porch in the evening had become a specific thing for Maeve and Grant that summer. Not planned, not formal, just the way the day tended to end when the light went long and gold and the work was done and supper was finished. They sat in the two chairs that had been on that porch since the spring they'd built the house, and they looked out over the fields and sometimes talked and sometimes didn't. The fields were full that July evening, the corn tall and healthy in the last of the light. The birds settled in their pens at the field edges. The settlement quiet around them with the particular peace of a summer day ending on a farm that has gotten through what it needed to get through. To the north, the Haverford land showed the same healthy green. Tom Alderton's mill sat quiet on the ridge. Somewhere across the track, two of the Selwick children were calling to each other in the dusk. Grant said, "Pross wrote again." "I know, I read it. 2 more cooperatives. That's..." He did the math. "Close to 100 farms now." 93, she said. He looked at her sideways. "Of course you know the exact number." She didn't answer because it didn't need an answer. 100 farms. 100 families who hadn't had to start from nothing the way she had. Who'd had a blueprint instead of a blank page. Who might or might not be sitting on their own porches right now looking at their own standing corn. She'd never know. That was fine. You didn't need to see a thing to have done it. She thought about her father again. Not with grief this time, or not only grief. She thought about the specific quality of helplessness she'd watched move through him after the Ohio swore warm, the thing that had dimmed him. And she thought about the difference between that helplessness
and what she'd felt standing in the corn in June of 1887, watching the swarm descend. She'd been terrified. She'd been inadequate to the size of what was happening. But she'd had something to do, and she'd done it, and the doing had been enough to matter. That was not a small thing. That was not a small thing at all. She looked out at her fields in the summer evening, and she felt the full weight of where she'd come from and where she was, not as 2 points on a line, but as the whole complicated distance between them. The $18, the mocking, the dead birds, the swarm, the exhaustion, the standing corn, the neighbors who'd come to her door with their hats in their hands, the merchant and his notebook, the January meeting, James Haverford asking questions at the edge of the corn, the 100 farms. None of it had been clean. None of it had been certain. She had been wrong about some things, and she'd learn over time what those things were, and she'd adjust. That was the work. The work was always the work. Grant reached over in the settling dusk and took her hand, not saying anything, just that. She let him hold it. The birds were quiet in their pens. The corn stood in the last light. The settlement breathed around them in the summer evening, and the land that had been working against them for 4 years lay patient and vast and indifferent in every direction, the way it always had and always would, because the land didn't care and never had. But the people on it were something else. The people on it were learning. And for now, on this porch, on this evening, with 100 farms carrying something she'd built from desperation and memory and a child's knowledge of what ruin looked like. For now, that was more than enough.